Hello and welcome to Ginger Prime. My name is Brian, and if you're a returning subscriber, welcome back, Chumbata. And if you happen to be new around here, just note that as we dive into the time of the Red and the world leading up to Cyberpunk 2077, I have a reading and speech impediment, so there might be a few words here and there that don't sound quite right to you, and hopefully you enjoy the video beyond that. But if it does bother you, no worries, I completely understand. But hopefully in this video, we're going to dive into a lot of information, and if you want to jump or skip any particular chapter, you can use the playhead below to find exactly what you're looking for. This is a deep lore video, and it derives heavily from the world of Cyberpunk Red. This is a time in which the game takes place in the 2040s, as well as everything that leads up to that point. Cyberpunk Red is written by Mike Pondsmith, David Ackerman, Jay Gray, James Hunt, and Cody Pondsmith. And if you want to purchase the tabletop RPG for yourself, I've included a link in the description of this video. So as an overview of the chapters, chapter 1, we're going to focus in on street slang. You can completely skip over this chapter if you are familiar with the world of Cyberpunk. Then from there, we're going to jump into the time of the Red, the Dark Future Countdown, Night City 2.0, and then finally finish it off with Everyday Things. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you do, be sure to hit that like button and that subscribe button and that share button if you feel like I've earned it. This is the best way you can say thank you to a content creator, is share out their content with others who you might feel would also enjoy this video as well. But without further ado, let's dive into chapter 1, Street Slang. The time of the Red is a slang term for the period from 2023 to the late 2030s, taken from the red skies common throughout the world, and it is an after effect of the Fourth Corporate War. Ivey is a common slang term for aerodyne. This is an automated flying bike vehicle that is powered by duct jet fans. AI refers to artificial intelligence, a computer with full self-awareness. Booster is any member of a gang that affects cyberware, leather clothing, and random violence. Combat drugs are any series of designer drugs created to increase speed, stamina, and reflexes. Chilled means to be cool and to be together. Chip is any type of data recording, usually in the form of a small colored slivers of plastic. Chipping in is to buy cyberware for the first time, to cast your lot with a group, and to connect with the machine. Chumbata, or chumba, is a Neo-Afro-American slang term for a friend or a family member. Chew is street slang for alcohol as used to power vehicles and power plants. The vast majority of vehicles in the time of the Red are fueled by advanced forms of alcohol with a higher burning temperature than normal methanol. A chromer is a 21st century heavy metal rock fan, and it happens to be a fan of chromatic rock, which is a type of heavy metal characterized by heavy electronics, simple rhythms, and violent lyrics. Cybered up is to get as much cyberware implanted as possible before going over the edge. Data term, a street corner informative machine with a screen, net inputs, and a keyboard. Dorfs are street slang for synthetic endorphins, a designer drug that increases healing powers, limits fatigue, and produces a rush familiar to that of a second wind. Exotic is a human biosculpted with a non-human element, such as fur, long ears, fangs, etc. The face, the interface jacking into cyberspace. Flatline is to kill a dead person or a thing. To go Leo is to make the trip to low orbit Earth, i.e. to visit one of the inner space stations. Gyro is a small 1 or 2 person helicopter mostly used in police work and corporate strike operations. A handle is a nickname, a working name, or as you're known by on the street. Hydro is street slang for hydrogen fuel used to power a sizable number of vehicles in the 2000s. Input is a girlfriend. Keyboard is street slang for a computer interface deck with manual keys, also known as a terminal. Netrun is to interface with the cyberspace system and hack into its programs and controls. It's also used to refer to running a global network until the advent of the Fourth Corporate War. An output is a boyfriend. Polymer one-shot is any cheap plastic pistol, usually in the 5 to 6 millimeter range. A poser gang is a group whose members all affect a specific look, style, or a body sculpt job. Rabids is a particularly deadly form of black ice spread throughout the old net after the death of their creator, netrunning legend Rosh Bartimos. A ripdoc is a surgeon specializing in implanting illegal cyberware. Ronin is a freelance assassin or mercenary, usually considered to be untrustworthy. Samurai is a corporate assassin or mercenary hired to protect the corporation property or make strikes against other corporation holdings. Slam it on is to get violent, to attack somebody without reason. The street is wherever you live, late at night. Also, the subculture, the underground, and suff it is to have sex, also to forget about something. Chapter 2. Welcome to the Time of the Red. The Time of the Red is not all that unfamiliar to someone who has lived through the 20-teens, that's 2013 to 2019, and through the boomtown years of the 2020s. What follows is a brief overview of just a few major factors of what shaped the cyberpunk world since the Fourth Corporate War ended and where things stand in the Time of the Red. In the United States, 32 years of corrupt government and financial destabilization has resulted in a nation divided by class, by race, and by economics. By the end of the 1980s, it was evident that the nation was in trouble. Most social norms had dissolved under an all-engulfing wave of competing special interest groups, media-fueled fad, and overall me-first worldview. By 1994, the number of homeless on the streets had skyrocketed to 21 million. The technical revolution had further torn the economy apart, creating two radically divergent classes: a wealthy, technically oriented, material adequate group of corporate professionals and a poor class of economically unstable, unskilled blue-collar workers. The middle class was nearly eradicated, and it was this dismal beginning that led the American landscape of the 2000s. In large cities, business areas were clean, neat, well-lit showcases, free of crime and poverty. They were controlled by powerful corporations. Ringing the central areas were the combat zones, decrepit, squalid suburbs, and burned-out ghettos teeming with booster gangs and other violent sociopaths. The outer suburbs were also corporate-controlled zones, safe, well-guarded tracts where executives raised their families in relative security. Throughout the Midwestern states, many small towns were abandoned as local farms, businesses, and banks collapsed in the wake of drought, famine, and economic chaos. The farms were all bought up by huge agro-corporations and were maintained with hired workers, machine labor, and well-equipped guards. The open freeway became battlegrounds as armed pack of booster gangs traveled from city to city, looting and pillaging like mechanized Visigoths. It wasn't all that bad though. In the cramped megacities that replaced the many small towns and suburbs that died in the collapse, a feverish explosion of technological wonders and headlong capitalism created a glitzy, superpowered world dominated by huge megacorporations that strode through the world like nations. They raised armies, fought for international domination, they shaped everything around them. Now, while below the glittering towers of the ultra-rich seethed an ever-growing population of destitute, starving people scrambling just to survive. The only leveler was technology, as the masses trapped on the street used cyberware, weapons, and raw cunning to beat their implacable corporate foes. Whether or not they were called edge runners, cyberpunks, or just plain rebels, they were the ones who stood against the power of the Megacorps and fought to win against all odds. This was the war as it was before the devastation of the Fourth Corporate War. Like the First and Second Corporate Wars, the Fourth Corporate War began when rival megacorps flexed their military muscle to achieve a financial objective. In 2021, HIAG, a megacorp specializing in underwater shipping and technology, went bankrupt, leading to two rival ocean-based megacorps, Sino and OTEC, squaring off for a hostile takeover of IHAG's remaining assets. At first, both corps engaged in the typical opening rounds of this kind of battle, stock manipulations and economic warfare, but as the conflict grew out of hand, both companies began to engage in outright warfare. Unable to gain an advantage, both megacorps then moved up to the next level of war. Each hired the forces of still larger megacorps to provide troops and military material. In this case, OTEC hired Militech, an armament and security force based in the United States, and Sino hired Arasaka, a security megacorp based out of Japan. As the two largest preliminary corporations in the world, both Militech and Arasaka had been spoiling for a fight for most of the late teens and early 20s, and the Sino-OTEC conflict provided the perfect excuse. As major international megacorps at the absolute apex of corporate power in the cyberpunk age, both combatants were in a military scale equal to many of the smaller nations of WW2. Fielding armies with tens of thousands of troops, both sides also possessed extremely advanced transportation and logistics systems, allowing them to strike at each other at anywhere on the planet. This combination of sophisticated military technology and lightning tactical movement made it all but impossible for many legitimate nations to stop the conflicts within their own borders. Small engagements soon flared into major showdowns until the battle reached a fever pitch worldwide, with forces from both megacorps engaged in major battles that embroiled entire cities. By mid-2022, pitched battles involving aircraft, AVs, tanks, power armor, and thousands of troops were the rule. Interdiction strikes in international trade were common as the strikes on energy production and transportation systems. Cyber attacks disrupted banking, information, and media services, and orbital space narrowly escaped becoming another battlefield only because the space-dwelling High-Riders began to hit both sides with lethal, subdual artillery strikes capable of wiping out most of the small city. The world was literally in the midst of a long-anticipated Third World War, albeit without the obligatory hurling of nuclear weapons between sides. Then came the Night City Holocaust. On August 20th, 2023, unknown forces detonated a pocket nuke on the upper floors of the Arasaka Towers complex in Night City, on the western US coast. The nuke, while not a city killer, reduced most of the central city to a rubble and killed thousands of people. It was never formally decided who had triggered the nuke. Some participants blamed Militech's overzealous desire to crush Arasaka, while still others blamed the detonation on an Arasaka area denial weapon set off to protect its headquarters. The Night City Holocaust was the last straw. Within hours, then U.S. President Elizabeth Kress nationalized Militech, placing it thoroughly under the control of the still sizable United States military, and banished all Arasaka forces from the contents of the U.S. under the threat of a retaliatory strike on Arasaka's Tokyo headquarters. Other nations swiftly followed the U.S.-led nationalization and/or interdicting assets of both participants of the war. The war is finally over, and now came the aftermath. In the aftermath of this worldwide conflict, atmospheric particles from the nuclear blast in Night City, as well as debris from orbital weapon strikes, conventional explosives, and the wartime burning of annihilated cities, the architectural areas created an eerie red pall over the skies worldwide. For nearly 2 years, skies were tinged with the bloody red color, which eventually died down into a brilliant red sunrises and sunsets throughout the next decade. Known as the Time of the Red, this would be the backdrop for the next few years of the post-war recovery. Only fading away from the battered populations of the world, they began to reconstruct their shattered cities. But despite the weakening of the atmospheric effects, the name has stuck around for the survivors of the worldwide effect. And as much as the 1920s was known as the Roaring Twenties, the 1930s as the Great Depression, the future histories the period between the end of the Fourth Corporate War and the present day, would probably always refer to it as the Time of the Red. Since the end of the Fourth Corporate War, the United States has lost much of its superpower status, but that doesn't matter much as most of Europe and the Far East are also in the same position. What the U.S. military exists as organized as combined operation groups, known as COGs, task force that combine ships, aircraft, armor, and infantry into a cohesive fighting battalion. Their main mission is to deal with threats to the Bosch-Wash corridor and the federal government's interest. On the other hand, since the Fourth Corporate War, several of these COGs have broken away from the United States and are operating as private armies for hire, running personal mini-kingdoms or in fact enacting as marauding packs of well-armed raiders. In many ways, the United States is very much as it was in the late 1800s, a civilized East Coast controlled by the federal government in Washington, D.C., a wild west of independent territories west of the Mississippi River, and an unincorporated West Coast from Seattle to Mexico. The territories are all pretty much on their own, hiring local militia or mercenary armies to keep the peace, while the sprawl of Night City is maintained by its own systems of interlocking local factions and power blocks. The United States government is still preliminary centered in Boston-Washington corridor, aka Boswatch, from New York to Miami, where it operates its effective region government, such as the region councils do for Night City. The branches of the federal government are still operative as of before. There is an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. These all have very little or no effect on anything past the Mississippi, and their members almost come exclusively from the East and near the Midwest. The current president is Elizabeth Kress, a hard-nosed, ex-military officer who was elected a year before the start of the now infamous Fourth Corporate War. Honest, fair, and tough enough to face down any threat to the U.S. sovereignty, Kress has held the job for over a decade, re-elected 4 times, in a total disregard for the rules of term limits. She is pretty much the only thing holding the US together after years of war and collapse. Now, Night City was still the place hardest hit during the war, and the damage is still everywhere nearly 20 years later. For starters, the city was surrounded by Miltech forces and under total Arasaka control by the tail end of the war. Street-to-street fighting was already savage, and the last few days before the nuke had approached a fever pitch. In some ways, the detonation was to become a clean end to the landscape, already littered with burning buildings, wrecked vehicles, and dead bodies. Over all of this was a dense red pall, the red, that painted everything the color of blood and poisoned the air for miles around. Post-war Night City was a wreck, but a wreck that was determined to rebuild, and one of the things that helped the most was the rebuilding process was the creation of the Pacifica Confederation. After the war, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, North Carolina, and British Columbia unified under an ad hoc loose union called the Pacifica Confederation. In the time of the Red, the Confederation is busy rebuilding their infrastructure. They also host several large US government bases which have permanent leases but do not otherwise exercise much control over the local population. This alliance has allowed Night City to survive as an independent city-state on its own. The rebuilding city has become a free trade zone for the Confederation, as well as an entry point for the rest of the world when it doesn't want to deal with the rest of the United States. In the time of the Red, Night City is a cybernetic Casablanca. With the like of its famous cinematic counterpart, it's dangerous, nearly lawless, and a great place to make a big score. One other useful thing in the process of rebuilding, the Washington-Oregon part of the Confederation has allowed a one-time petrochemical subsidiary, Bioteka, free to reign and design and release a number of experimental plants and animals, which they hope that will restore the once burgeoning ecology. So be careful out in the woods, kids. Overall, the Pacifica Confederation is a powerful economic region, a made trade point to what remains of Asia, with access to lots of military power too. The local combined operation groups of Brereton and Fort Lewis McChord have generally supported the stable and sensible locals over the unstable Maine US government. Kress's new United States is going to have to work hard indeed to woo the Confederation into an allied membership, of which that they can work with Washington, D.C. in exchange for a great deal of independent governance. The Confederation's members are also willing to work with the rising new Megacorps, but their own stringent terms sort of screw up Mr. Megacorp and will call on our friends at Lewis McChord to flatten you policy. But they are too economically powerful to need to actually sell out to the new megacorps that are not going to change much in the next few decades. So while the corps are ubiquitous in Night City, they walk a much more careful line, knowing that the locals are capable of waging their own corporate warfare against them. In the time of the Red, this relationship is in the process of being defined, and the Corps are currently learning the hard way that the Seattle, Vancouver, Victoria boys do not fool around. In the time of the Red, everyone walks lightly in the Pacifica Confed. The Eurotheatre has been badly battered by the war and subsequent loss of its ESA and orbital colonies to the Outriders. The World Stock Exchange and the common market have managed to maintain a stability economy in which most of the European nations participate. The exceptions are Italy, Spain, and Greece, all of which are now suffering violent chronic political upheavals. Here and the international corporations still have a great deal of power, but various eco-governments have skillfully used the war to keep the Euro business barons under control. Only Great Britain has suffered major economic troubles. Swamped by massive immigration and antiquated technology base, its streets are still almost as explosively dangerous as the United States. The rest of Europe is in recovery mode, as individual nation-states struggle to rebuild damaged financial and industrial hubs affected by the war. Despite the massive reforms of the early 1990s and still the subsequent purge of the hardliners in 1991, New Russia is still weakened by antiquated technology and still cannot feed its hungry population. Although the war has leveled the playing field a bit, with the continued failure of the region's economic social reforms, hardliners are once again gaining strength with a showdown between the surviving Cold Warriors and a new generation of aggressive oligarchs that is coming in fast. These oligarchs are similar to the megacorps of the roaring 2020s, hungry, dangerous, and willing to use heavy amounts of bribery, murder, and mayhem to accomplish their aims. The meltdown of the 90s left vast areas of Iran, Libya, Iraq, Chad, and the Arab Emirates as radioactive fields of glass. Only Egypt, Syria, and Israel survived intact, and because of their already ruined state, were mercifully left alone for most of the war. But new alliances and power blocks are struggling to take control once again that mega-corporate powers have been curated. With the world trade in oil and raw materials disrupted by corporate conflict, there is a new interest in mainlining the remains of the meltdown nations. In this response, many of the national groups in the Middle East are starting to bond together to reform and resist the invaders. Regarding Africa, once a fractured continent of warring countries under a bewildering array of dictators, democracies, and socialist states, the new Africa was born as Euro nations negotiated with these scattered nations to build the Kilimanjaro mass driver. The African states have since established a solid foothold in space. Nearly one-third of all space construction workers are African, and the majority of the spaceport facilities that construct the areas are also on African soil. The resulting population has evolved into a national group called Outriders, a space-based technology society linked by Pan-African roots and a determination to never be victims of colonial aggression again. Declaring their independence during the war and enforcing it with commandeering orbital weapons, the Outrider Assembly is carefully neutral in the time of the Red, ready to deal with all sides as long as their sovereignty and control of space is respected. The Far East and Asia are now a hodgepodge of damaged nations, with Japan slowly recovering from the ravages of the Arasaka Corporation's abortive coup. China is still recovering from the loss of Hong Kong through the biological terror attack and fierce battles in both South China Sea and the Mongolian Plateau for access to strategic resources has left the government exhausted and almost tottering. Korea, both North and South, have become strongly isolationist, although North Korea, drawn from the conflict by promises of Arasaka support, has collapsed into a chaos of warlords and petty fiefdoms, hammered by the savage fighting over trade routes and oil fields. Such as Southeast Asia and the Philippines and Australia are isolated, damaged, and potentially prey for the next powerful group that comes along. After several lengthy wars in the United States in the 1990s and the 2000s, Central America emerged as a strong union of independent states working under the Pact of Mutual Cooperation. The U.S. was expelled from all but the Panama Canal Zone, which still holds by sheer military force against ongoing guerrilla oppression. But during the war, nationalist factions in Brazil and Colombia used the corporate fighting to support their own bids for land and influence. The result was a shattering of the old alliances and is only now the beginning to be rebuilt. The Megacorps in the time of the Red. The Fourth Corporate War ended the age of corporate domination. Even if they were not involved in open combat, many Megacorps found their operations fatally wounded through the breakdown of communications, net information systems, global transport disruption, and collateral damage. But the new Megacorps aren't out of the picture entirely. In many cases, local and regional offices continue to operate in reduced capacity, if they could get their materials and their funding to do so. These companies sometimes rename themselves but continued where possible to provide service where they were known for. Some corps like Raven Microsib broke into smaller units that shattered a common trade dress, but were often run entirely by different corporate officers. Still, other corps just fell apart entirely but found their assets seized by competitors or ambitious regional managers hoping to cobble together a personal corporate fiefdom. The result in what the time of the Red is that the Megacorps aren't all that mega anymore. These corpos, as they are dubbed on the street, are closer to what corporations were in the mid-20th century. Local companies, powerful on a regional or even national scale, but without an enormous international reach of the roaring 2020s. But this isn't to mean that they're toothless, far from it. Corps in the time of the Red are, if anything, more rapacious and power-hungry. There are fewer rules out there, and ambitious players in the front office are willing to do practically anything to gain an advantage over the resource of a market. They may or may not be able to field giant armies with tanks and troops, but they can still deploy powerful covert ops squads to bribe the right government overseers to allow them to take their enemies when it is important enough for them. It's just that in this post-war environment, the most determined edge runners can also field hardware and advantages that can often equal those of the smaller corps, and there are often a fair number of edge runners who are using the open market to start their own baby corps, to take the tottering old guys. They were new and dangerous game to be played out there in the marketplace and in the fragmented new age where everyone can play. So welcome to the time of Red, Chimbata. It's more dangerous than the old, once glamorous and hypercharged lost time of the Cyberpunk 2020s. The body count is higher, and the stakes are even nastier, but that's not going to stop us, or stop you, is it? I didn't think so. Trace. Thank you guys all so much for watching and listening to this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and that you check out future videos for chapter 3, 4, and 5. I decided to kind of break them up, and that way you guys can kind of consume which parts that you want a little bit more logically. Obviously the length of these videos is quite substantial, and so if you hung out the entire time, I really appreciate you. And check the top link in the description of this video for the Cyberpunk playlist. That way you can get the lore, you can get the guides, you can get all kind of news that we'll be doing for covering as we lead up to Cyberpunk 2077. For Ginger Prime, my name's Brian. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day. But until next time, take care.